Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of 10,000 Heroes. This is a debrief episode. I'm going to just make this short. Nate and I are going to talk about the John Giuliano episode, John Giuliano interview. But if you haven't listened to that, it's amazing. Listen to it. That guy changed my life 20 years ago and continues to do so every time I interact with him. And just a hint here. At the end of this episode, there is a special invitation for you, the listener, and it might change your life. So, check it out. Before we begin this episode, I want to put in a quick word from our sponsor, me. We got the name for this podcast from the mission of Momentum Lab, our coaching program. We are both incubating the next generation of heroes and the next step in the evolution of consciousness. If you listen to the show, you're already a part of that process. Thank you. So if you haven't already, sign up for the newsletter to get insights, tools, and inspiration on living a purposeful, visionary, and impactful life. And if it ever dawns on you that that's easier to do with a community of excellence urging you on, that it can make the difference in you achieving your personal goals, check out Momentum Lab. Okay, back to the show.
This discussion with John Giuliano was maybe one of my favorite. I know you say that probably. I should go back and listen. I should go back and listen to all our debriefs. I'm sure I say that every time.
I often say that about the interviews I do too. Yeah, I'm with you.
But the subject matter here really hit home for me on a number of levels, which we'll jump into. But you've known this man most of your adult life. Last 20 years or so.
Exactly.
Maybe you give us a little bit of an intro. Would you mind just kind of saying briefly the impact that this person has had on you? I know it's significant.
Yeah. Wow. It's really significant. It was my first exposure to what it was to lead a life of service. Mm-hmm. And I'm aware of, because I use that term with people, and people have a lot of reactions to that term. Like that's got like a negative valence for some people. So maybe I should go into it.
Right.
I mean, really joyful dedication to this larger notion of the self in which everyone is included. And so when I went to visit John in El Salvador, lived in this village where he was just so... maybe it was my first real exposure to what community is. And maybe community is like the precondition for the kind of service I'm talking about, where someone is so dedicated, but it's not in this like subject object, like giving out a handout, like one hand giving, the other hand receiving way. And it's really in this like togetherness, hand in hand way. And he, I was exposed to a lot more of that philosophy and the evidence of that when I was in India, the Gandhian work. But this prefigured all that by maybe 5 or more years, and was just, I later realized like, oh, he's this like amazing example of Gandhian social work that I had met years before. He really planted that seed in me of like, this is how one can live and move in the world and be in just total joy and authenticity and in service, and be totally, there's no self-abnegation to it, or self-criticism or self-violence. It's just all like, yeah, this is how I want to be. So
I imagine some of that negative valence. I wonder, just to pause on that note for a second, I wonder if it bumps up against people's different views on sort of altruism or self-sacrifice, that maybe raises some flags or something. The way I experienced you saying it right now, and what I get from the conversation with John, is that it's either a substitution or at least adjacent to this idea of purpose. And it's interesting to me because you guys mention purpose explicitly in the beginning and then never talk about it.
Never again. Yeah.
It- you know, I think even John says, "Yeah, well, purpose, yeah, of course." And then, but then through the telling of his story, you get a very clear idea.
Totally.
And what I'm left with as he tells his story, in terms of purpose or service, maybe, is how useful it is amid chaos or indecision or uncertainty. When I hear John telling the early days of his kind of adult life or his journey on his path, there's not like a clear direction. You know,
Mm-mm.
it's not necessarily kind of the chain of inspiration that you talk about with our clients and kind of the different time horizons, and you derive different goals.
Oh, not at all.
He
Yeah.
just had this connection to an ideal or perhaps a calling. And then from there, things get a lot easier and a lot more playful, it seems like, for him. Maybe not easier, because he has a knack for putting himself in harm's way
Yeah.
and some pretty intense situations. But I don't hear him calculating the path.
No. Yeah.
I hear this profound sense of devotion and commitment. But he could be, I love this image of him drinking champagne in the back of a limousine, pulling up in the barrio in San Diego, this limo full of nuns that he's trying to smuggle into the country. And just that image strikes such a dissonant chord, or what you might expect from a man of the cloth.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And he's doing that through the entire interview. And maybe that's this great gift of this idea of liberation theology, right? This thing that's born out of all this conflict and this like great need to heal and bring justice to a land, to a people. And it seems to me, it strikes me that when you have such a powerful imperative like he has, the other thing, you don't sweat the small stuff quite as much. Is that
Yeah.
does that
Yeah. No.
resonate with you?
Yeah. Totally. I mean, the thing that comes to mind, just this like amazing synthesis of being totally dedicated to whatever the ideal is, not having a plan, and being totally authentically himself is him.
Mhm.
He's working with these kids, and I don't think we even got to this in the interview, but after the war in El Salvador, he started, you could call it an organization, but basically he just went and lived in the community and did all these different projects. And I think maybe he mentions the first one is just going out into the hills and finding the dead and burying the dead. And that was their first project. And I think that took maybe a year. And then he continued and did all these other projects with the kids and with the adults, from organic farming to building toilets to education. It was all this different stuff. But part of it was like athleticism and just getting people moving and just this
Yeah.
sports, right? Like all the benefits sports can provide. So he started the national ice hockey team in El Salvador just because he loves ice hockey. He grew up in the Bronx. So that's what I mean of like, he's just like, yeah, what can I do? How can I communicate this passion I have? How can we, it could be any sport. I mean, you probably should have done like soccer, right? I mean, I think they probably also did, but he's like, no, man, I love ice hockey. We're going to do ice hockey. I just love that.
Well, we might as well start at the end of the interview then, because you guys do get into it.
Do we? Okay.
And,
yeah.
And just to say for the listener, you've recorded a couple of these interviews now, and we're gonna air them all. We're gonna have John back as much.
Oh yeah, my intention is to have. If I could have him on every week,
it's gonna be like he's gonna be a regular, like Micah.
Yeah. We're gonna get just some more regulars this quarter.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
So you guys do get into it, the Tamarindo Foundation, some of the work, and actually, slight correction there. At least from my recollection of the interview, the first thing they do is cry.
Hmm.
And he goes on this tour of grief. Do you remember this?
The bike tour.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He goes on this tour where he's just going places and crying. Because, well, at least I was crying. Just to process all the violence and atrocity that experienced there. And so another thing that kind of strikes me for still kind of uncovering this idea of purpose as it relates to John is that I could say from maybe on the outside what it looks like, that if he started with an ideal, what he's created, what he feels about this organization, he's talking about the safety and the opportunity. Those are kind of the two main points he's hitting when he talks about what this organization provides. And I hear a fully realized vision. I mean, it's cooked. It's fleshed out. It's having the impact that he intends. He's in a place. He has the resources, the connections, the network. It's all there. Like, you can imagine someone had sat down 20 years ago and sketched all this out, but he didn't. And maybe he was just operating from a feeling, or like you said, an ideal, commitment to this ideal.
Well, I think there's a shift, and so he's going to listen to this, and then he's going to give us the feedback of whether this is right or not. So here's my postulate: is that there's, and maybe I'm projecting because this is also in some sense, this is like my life, but though in my case, it's much less dramatic and impressive. But there's this exploratory phase. It's like the hero's journey, where he's like biking across the country. He's part of the Jesuits. He's getting kicked out of countries. He's fighting civil wars, doing all this kind of random stuff. And there's no plan. There's just inquiry, experimentation, exploration in service of this ideal. And then he lands after the war in Guajila. And he has this intention of rebuilding, of helping this community rebuild, of being part of this community and rebuilding with his fellow humans there. And at that point, my guess is that this vision was fully flowered. He had all of the knowledge at that point to know what it would look like to have a really healthy, integrated village that was the opposite of these people that had been literally blown away and blown across the border into Honduras from the Civil War. But he didn't know how to get there. And that to me is much more similar to like the work we're doing in our coaching, where you have someone like set a really beautiful long-term vision, and then you support them in doing various kinds of experiments to get you there. So he's probably run, I don't know, 100, 200 different programs with his kids. And, maybe like 70 of them just die immediately. Just were not good ideas. And another 50 lasted a year and then quit. And then another 50 are going for 20 years or 30 years. So that's how I would present it. And I think that reflects at least my own experience of life too. There's this open exploratory inquiry for a long time. And then you're like, oh, this is something that's worth building. And that's when all those like planning tools, I think, become more relevant, at least for me.
Yeah, that makes sense to me, Ank. That makes sense to me. I guess what fascinates me most about John, again, is his playfulness. And I wonder how someone might know when they're in that exploratory phase. I think there's a great deal of permission needed to actually fully enjoy and fully to get the most out of that phase, and to ensure that you're ready for that shift or that flowering that you said. But it's not intuitive, right? I mean, a lot of the messages that are coming at us would say you don't have time to do that. You have to start working towards something, achieve the thing, have an idea about what it is. And when I encounter people that maybe are unsure, feel directionless, the idea that you can just be where you are, be in this exploration of either some commitment to service, an ideal, a vision, even if it's a vague notion that you're headed in that direction, but being really committed to that in the way that I really understand that John was. You also, and maybe this is from John's influence, had a period like that.
Oh yeah.
Maybe most of your life.
Yeah.
But there was a long period after college where you got this, top-notch training as a programmer, mathematician, Stanford University. And then you decided to go open up a restaurant in Brazil and live in India.
Yeah. So I think there's there's a difference.
Yeah.
There's a subtle difference here between directionless and goal oriented.
Mm-hmm. Can you help me understand that better?
And it wasn't until I learned recently, like 3 years ago, about goals that I kind of got this a little bit more, because I was always like anti goal in a way. But I was never directionless. I always had things that motivated me and I was deeply passionate about. They just didn't string together in a way that was obvious where it was leading. Whereas like you leave undergraduate and you're like, I'm going to be on the Supreme Court, like the girl across the hall from me freshman year. She had a real set of milestones and things that she should do in order to become a Supreme Court justice. And every adventure she went on was like a building block in this like larger adventure of being a Supreme Court justice. And now I'm operating more in that framework. I have this like larger plan I want to build. Not quite sure how to get there, but there's like different steps that I can do, and I can do these experiments and eventually build to it. But before that, it wasn't that I was directionless. It's just that the plan of how each of these adventures was connected and building to something larger was not evident. One could say that there probably still was a way that they were building together. I mean, I'm sure there is now. Now that I look back on it, I'm like, oh, because every single one of those pieces contributed to what I'm doing now, and I couldn't do what I'm doing now without all of those pieces. So now it's like, hindsight is 2020. Retroactively, I built what we're doing now based on all those things. So of course they have to be included, right? But at the time, it wasn't explicit. I didn't know that, but it wasn't orchestrated by me, but it wasn't directionless.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is super interesting. I think this is an area that's maybe under-discussed, at least by us. This idea of inquiry. The way you're talking, it reminds me of rehearsing a play. And when you go into rehearsals for a play, there's an opening night at the end of that process. And there will be this play, this thing you create with your colleagues. But in the rehearsal process, you don't really know what's happening. And you shouldn't. You're really committed to this unknowing, this investigation. You have an idea of where you're going. You're going to get there. And there's a confidence and a faith that you're going to get there. But it's actually, you get the most out of that process by letting go of what you think is supposed to happen in any moment. Right? It's going to give you the best opportunity for discovery if you can really stay with it, right? And not kind of rush to an answer or rush to a choice that you think someone's going to like, the director's going to like, or that'll make the audience laugh.
So it's not there's no schedule in advance of these are the days and this is the scene you do on each day?
Yes. There's a rehearsal schedule. But your performance, your moment to moment rehearsal with your scene partners, being in the scene, what you're gonna do, how you're gonna affect that person, how they're gonna listen and respond and then affect you back. That you don't know, you can't know, right? Because it's totally dynamic. And actually, if you go in with an idea to that process, you're limiting yourself, you're holding yourself back from the type of discoveries that are going to be the most brilliant, the most inspiring, the deepest penetrating choices that you can make. You're not going to have access to that because you've already gone in with an idea. So maybe I'd compare that to, and not to disparage someone that graduates Stanford and wants to be a Supreme Court justice. That's awesome. But more relating to your spirit of discovery and experimentation, there's actually also maybe equally or more so a commitment to that path. There's actually a kind of discipline. Maybe from the outside, someone could say, oh, that person is just kind of squandering their time. They're not going in. They're directionless. But actually someone who's decided internally, intrinsically, this is what's important. This is what's meaningful for me in my life. They have a great direction, a great discipline, commitment to that.
Yeah, yeah. I love that, and I think it's so true. And along the way, certainly true in my case, and I'm sure it's true in John's case. There's so many offers and opportunities that are that can take you off that path. Like so many times, people would like offer you a job, or just something to like be like, oh, why don't you stop messing around? Here's this thing you could do and have some stability, and close down all of that exploration and just like be a little more normal, man. And I'm sure John got hit with that hundreds of times during that path.
Well, Jocko said that entirely he just runs. I don't know if he's thinking, he says, wasn't maybe probably cognizant, but he's just running in the other direction all the time. I mean, it strikes me that there's like moments in this journey that he makes a choice that I would personally have a total aversion to. I don't think I've ever shared this with you, but I have an irrational, maybe it's not irrational, but I have a fear of prisons. I have a long, I have a long stand, I have a long standing terror. I don't know. See, I mean, my father worked in the California prisons, and I have family that was in prison. It was around, you know. My dad talked about it in this way that was equal parts romanticized, and then also meant to scare the shit out of me.
Mm.
And it totally worked. You know, I do not want to spend a day in prison. I can feel it in my whole bones. It's just something that was embedded there early. And so when John stumbles upon La Ocho and he's talking about the smells and the fear, you could like smell the fear. That my dad would talk about this. You could smell like urine and fear when you would walk into a prison. We would always talk about the smell, you know, and I think John refers to that, and he's like a pig in shit. He's so happy. It's like this joyful memory from his
Oh yeah.
past.
Oh totally.
And then I got to paint, and then I had this idea. I'm gonna be a prison painter, and now I can spend even more time there, and I can really watch. And so it's really interesting that because he's operating from this commitment to run towards something that isn't necessarily defined, it opens up all those opportunities you talked about for distraction. Well, there's an equal number of opportunities, I'm sure, that are non-intuitive, that are the perfect opportunities to forward this development, to forward this investigation. And so when I hear him laying out these breadcrumbs, making choice after choice of just like, what the heck? This guy is running towards war zones, towards just the most abject, you know, human atrocities, oppression, just he's running towards it. And I think that's a really interesting instinct and very, very unique. You know, often when I see people that have really matured or established themselves in some way, maybe in art or perfecting some craft, mastery, devoting themselves to service, if you kind of put it on paper, it almost looks like a defect.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's so abnormal, some of the decisions that you have to make, the sacrifices you have to make. And
Well, I
you
mean,
know,
that's because I would say our society and our norms are so far from the ethical basis that John and Romero and Jesus and Gandhi are using. So our society is just way out of line with just like the basic ethical framework of service and compassion, which is what allows us to do all the things we do on a daily basis.
yeah, it's almost inverted. It's like on its head. So you just mentioned Archbishop Romero, Oscar Romero, who was assassinated and kind of sparked the big civil war.
Yeah.
And the story that John tells in the interview, it's interesting to me too, is another parable of this, is that this wasn't from John's telling, not necessarily a courageous man by nature. that he was meek, and he says he's actually fearful for most of the time. He's actually very scared. And so this brings up this idea again, actually, that we talked about before, of kind of the love versus fear came up in the Micah conversation. And this is an example of what I mean when this topic comes up, because this is love in the context of fear. And of course, it's war. It's a terrifying situation. The terror, the fear that's happening in your body, that's not really within your control if you're in a situation like that. And that's going to be there. But what's in his control is the decision about what to do next.
Yeah. And Romero grows into it, right? He grows into the courage. And just to bring a little wisdom from Gandhi, and this is like, for me, this is knowledge of, Uncle Jamal would say, this is knowledge of the tongue, not knowledge of the heart, because I don't understand this experientially, but I understand it intellectually. So Gandhiji, in his whole book, My Experiments with Truth, his autobiography, which covers just a few decades of his life. He wrote it before he did any of I think even before the Salt March of the freedom struggle in India. The whole thing is that he's doing all these wacky experiments with diet and other, sexuality, other parts of his life, abstinence and all these forms, precisely in order so that when it comes to a crisis moment, his impulse will not be fear of death. So when there is like a riot in the streets, his instinctual, he's retraining it. So his instinctual impulse is to run towards the danger and save someone rather than to save his own skin. And all of his stuff around drinking and eating and all that and salt is in service of that. And so just to say, and maybe, I don't know much more about Romero than, what I studied from John over the last few decades and the movies and whatnot. But there may have been some sort of similar process. And John tells the story of Romero in that church, like gathering his strength and his spirits and being like, all right, when I come out, game on, but it takes a long training process to then go out and say every Sunday or whatever day he spoke, stuff that is going to get you killed. Which he did, knowing he would get killed, and then he was.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and all of it's conjecture. I don't know what he was feeling, but I imagine the fear doesn't go away. Even as you commit, you get deeper into the path. And as the danger is mounting, right? The conflict is mounting. But this thing that you're talking about, that you're consciously, it reminds me of like a Zen training or meditation. They say you're training to die, in a sense. But this idea you don't know what's coming, and that all these experiments are training you in a way. I haven't read the documentary or the biography. I don't know like how cognizant he was that was actually the intention. It doesn't seem like that's what John was up to. He was just doing the next thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
He was just doing the next thing in front of him. And yet each one of those gates that he had to cross was preparing him for this. And all he was really carrying, as I understand it, or what I hear him saying, is these ideals of love and community. He doesn't know what it's going to look like. He doesn't know what it's going to require of him. And so he's just kind of going around to see, hey, this guy's named Posole, the coyote. Hey, can I go across the border with, like, who has that idea to like just make a couple trips across the border just to see what it's like? But now, in the scope of things, I hear that saying, you look back in gratitude, right? In the moment, I can't imagine that you would see how all these puzzle pieces fit together. So there's like real surrender to the mystery of it and the journey of it. And I think that's like, I guess that's what I'm really landing on heavy in this conversation. This is turning into the theme of our talk, because I think that resolves a lot of the kind of resistance there. Like you said, some people have this reaction or resistance to the idea of service. Other people on the other side have this, like as you did, admittedly have this reaction to goal setting or achievement. And I think that this is a way to resolve those two energies, resolve those two modes of operation, where it's actually part of the plan to be completely surrendered to what's coming next and to just do the next thing and see where it goes. And well, that's wonderful. At least for my own sake, to communicate to people, I think it's really, I feel really grateful to have a little bit deeper understanding of that. That it doesn't have to be, just because you brought some intentionality to your life, just because you've applied some structure to that learning and experimentation, doesn't mean you've taken yourself out of the game of surrender, exploration, discovery, mystery. They're not mutually exclusive, in other words.
They're not mutually exclusive. That's great. That's what it is. And I just want to announce as we close this, my intention to repost the fragment of that episode about Romero, which is just 15 minutes, at some point in the future, just because it's so good and so deep. And not everyone's going to listen like the whole, I don't know how long the John episode was. Maybe it was like 90 minutes or more. So it was our longest one. But I want to repost that Romero because it has incredible historical value and just like heart opening value.
Yeah, the historical value, people should just sit down and listen to this podcast. And I don't know that I'll do it justice. There's no reason to recap it here. People can just go back and listen. But what an important piece of history, and also our involvement from the United States, the culpability and responsibility that we have there. The way John tells that story, it's epic. It's totally mythic. This tomato, this half a tomato, this campesino sits down and pulls out his machete, and I had the image so vivid in my mind when he was telling that. This guy gives him half a tomato. What do you think that was all about?
Yeah, he has no idea. Yeah.
What was that? What's that guy doing? So that's all he had to eat. He was giving you half. And that he was so struck by that was like he said, I think John says he was converted by a tomato.
Yeah.
And that could be a Greek myth.
Yeah.
What a gift and that it launches into this incredible adventure and tragic demise. But what a story.
Yeah. Okay. One more announcement. This is another intention. This is for you, Nate, and this is for everybody who's listening.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, John just changed my life fundamentally. Continues to change my life to be in a relationship with him. That's why I want to have him on more often on the show. But I want to find a way for everyone who wants to, everyone who's listening to this, to go down and visit John in El Salvador. And I want you to come, Nate. And and that's part of their thing with his organization, the Guajira Tamarindo, is to get more of this like cross-cultural interaction. So I don't know how it's going to form, but I just want to put that out there.
Okay, well, I received the invitation. Cool. Well, thank you, Encore, for, meeting John, taking the time to cultivate the relationship over all these years, and then inviting him on this podcast. I invite the listener, if you have it in you, to listen again. I've listened to this episode 3 times now. And you heard it here first, folks. Encore's inviting you all to come with us. So reach out if you're interested. We'll start putting those puzzle pieces together. Thank you all so much for listening. Please continue to do so. Reach out to us any way that's convenient for you. Check the information beneath the episode and the show notes. Actually, Martine's going to pop in right now with some relevant announcements.
Hi everyone, this is Martin Stan, your producer, audio editor, and sound designer in chief for the 10,000 Heroes team. I just wanted to take a minute to thank you for listening to our show. Let me tell you a couple of things. 10,000 Heroes is brought to you by the team at Momentum Lab. Pierre does our artwork, DJ Plainview composed our theme music, and I handle all the editing, production, and sound design. Please, if you like the show, follow it, rate it, tell your friends about it, and write to us. That really helps us make the impact we want to make. And now we are closing this episode with a word from our main sponsor, who also happens to be our host, Anchor.
And now a message from our sponsor, me again. 10,000 Heroes is brought to you by Momentum Lab. I normally refer to Momentum Lab as a coaching program or a goal accelerator, but it's really more like a master's degree in life. When you join Momentum Lab, we help you get crystal clear on what it is you actually want, who you want to be, what you want to do, and how you want to contribute. And then we get into all the painful details of what has been blocking you this whole time. And then we give you the knowledge, the tools, and the support you need to get there. Sometimes that's a spreadsheet, sometimes it's a mindset hack, sometimes it's a lecture, and sometimes it's a hug. Our only attachment is to your higher self. So, when you're ready to be the next version of yourself, in your business, for your family, or just for your own sense of fulfillment, drop me a line. Bye!